The cold seemed to cut to the bone in that isolated base in the far north. The wind beat against the metal walls, making the sound spread through the corridors like a constant wail. Inside, among modern computers, tracking equipment, and screens displaying real-time data, there was a seldom-visited corner, a desk strewn with yellowed papers, scratched clipboards, and notebooks filled with meticulous notes. It was there that she spent hours, immersed in a world most considered obsolete. Ancient maps, scribbled by hands that no longer existed, with symbols and lines that almost no one bothered to understand. The scene repeated itself day after day, her, hunched over the desk, pencil in hand, her blue eyes scanning every feature as if searching for a hidden secret. And inevitably, someone would pass by, make a comment, and draw laughter from the others. "Still trying to find pirate treasure?" one of the engineers would say with a wry smile. Another added, "I bet those maps show where the penguins bury their gold." The jokes were always laced with sarcasm, and the room would fill with muffled laughter. For them in the 21st century, wasting time on decades-old documents was a waste of energy. The base had cutting-edge technology, reconnaissance drones, seismic sensors, and satellite imagery. What could possibly be useful in old faded drawings? That's what they thought. But for her, every line carried weight, every note had a story. It wasn't there by chance. There was something in the records that disturbed her, something modern systems ignored because they weren't programmed to sense it. The atmosphere was silently hostile. There were no direct confrontations, but rather that indifference that was colder than the wind outside. As she passed through the hallways, some looked away, others exchanged knowing smiles. In the cafeteria, she felt the conversations quieten as she approached. The message was clear. She was different, and different in that place meant easy pickings. Still, he wouldn't give in. He returned to his desk every day, carefully turning pages, using rulers and compasses to superimpose the old routes onto the base's current plans. Every now and then, he found curious markings, small circles, arrows indicating areas that were now covered by buildings or completely buried under snow. Some of these points were accompanied by handwritten notes, as if they were clues to something larger. Most intriguing was a series of lines that, according to the maps, formed a set of underground corridors connecting different sectors of the region. Officially, none of this existed in current records. If those tunnels had ever been built, they had been forgotten or purposefully erased from the base's history. But she saw the patterns repeating themselves in the various documents, as if someone decades ago had tried to preserve this information for those who knew how to look for it. The hours alone, the attention to detail, and the tireless focus began to become part of her routine, almost like a ritual. While the rest of the team rushed to deal with recent data and immediate missions, she cultivated the patience of someone who knows that certain answers aren't found in the obvious. However, her patience was interpreted as futility. The label of time waster stuck to her name, and no one bothered to hide it. One of the most humiliating moments occurred during a planning meeting. When asked about the progress of her analyses, she began explaining the overlapping maps and the possible existence of unrecorded passages. Before she could finish, an officer interrupted, "So you're building theories based on old paper. What a great use of resources." The room erupted in laughter and she felt her face burn, but she didn't back down. She simply took a deep breath and continued staring at the papers, pretending the collective laughter hadn't punctured her pride. Outside, the landscape seemed unchanged, ice, wind, and silence. Inside, the hours passed amidst disdainful glances and an ever-increasing effort to ignore the taunts. What they didn't know was that, even as they mocked, she was connecting dots no one else saw. And unbeknownst to them, those ancient drawings held the key to an event that would change everything. If this story is already captivating you, and you want to see how far this twist will go, like it now and subscribe to the channel to follow every detail of this journey. And have you ever been underestimated for believing in something that others didn't see, but that ended up changing everything? The night hours stretched like a silent carpet before her, and while most at the base drifted into deep sleep, she remained there, beneath the cold, static light of a solitary lamp. The table was cluttered with yellowed pages, folded maps, and records so old the paper exuded a faintly sweet scent of dust and age. Her fingers, protected only by thin gloves, glided carefully over the hand-drawn lines and curves, as if touching something sacred. It wasn't just curiosity that drove her. It was something closer to a silent addiction, a calling that wouldn't cease even when her body begged for rest. Every mark, every note lost in the corner of a page, seemed to scream for attention. She didn't look at the maps the way others might. To anyone else, those blueprints would be mere technical representations of the structure and terrain surrounding the base. To her, they were puzzles waiting to be solved. While others saw corridors and rooms, she saw patterns, repetitions, shadows where logic couldn't reach. The broken lines, the irregular scales, the small differences between versions from different decades, everything took on meaning. The historical records, dusty and neglected, became pieces of a larger puzzle that only she seemed willing to put together. The early morning silence amplified the sound of her pencil tip gliding across the paper, outlining areas that seemed innocent at first glance, but which, with attention, revealed subtle marks. Sometimes they were extremely fine, almost invisible lines, as if the artist had intended them to go unnoticed. Other times, they were hurried scribbles, written in the margins in such small, irregular handwriting that only extreme patience could decipher them. And there, between one drawing and another, she found symbols that were not part of the common technical standard. Small triangles, broken lines, abbreviated acronyms that did not appear in any official manual. Little by little, the stack of papers beside her grew. Each new sheet represented another detail fitted together, another piece of the mystery revealed. She noticed connections between documents that, to anyone else, would have been mere unrelated files. Plans from different eras overlapped like layers of a single body, revealing passages that a single, isolated map would never reveal. In some notes nearly erased by time, she read references to safety routes and unrecorded escape points. Words that, in such a remote and isolated context, sounded like dangerous secrets. Her obsession grew as she progressed. There was no clock that could stop her, no fatigue that could convince her to leave her desk. The hours slipped by without her noticing, marked only by the changing intensity of the cold that penetrated the structure of the base. When she found something new, a poorly erased scribble, a number that repeated on different maps, she felt an almost physical impulse, as if each discovery were fuel. There was no room for distractions. She lived in that moment as if she were the only person in the world capable of understanding the truth hidden beneath those lines. As he cross-referenced data and overlaid blueprints, a disturbing idea began to take shape. There was more beneath their feet than anyone imagined. Underground passages, indicated by ghostly lines on the maps, suggested connections between sectors that never officially existed. Some ended at points marked only with a hand-drawn X. Others extended beyond the known boundaries of the base, disappearing into the white void of the frozen landscape. Most intriguingly, in the most recent records, these passages simply didn't exist, as if someone, at some point, had decided to erase them from history. This only made the search more urgent. Each new clue was a personal challenge, a silent message that she was on the right path. And the deeper she delved into this labyrinth of paper, the clearer the feeling became that she wasn't just studying ancient blueprints. She was deciphering a code left by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Maybe a warning, maybe an invitation. The world outside might be plunged into cold and darkness, but to her, in that moment, nothing was more real than the lines beneath her eyes. Those maps weren't just drawings. They were the key to a mystery no one else seemed willing to see. If you found an ancient map with secret passages erased from history, would you follow it or leave it behind? The air always seemed charged, not just by the biting cold that invaded every crevice of the base, but by something denser, almost palpable, that came from the forced coexistence. Being surrounded by the same steel walls day and night, with the wind howling outside as a constant reminder that there was nowhere to escape, created an invisible weight on everyone. The extreme climate was not only a physical challenge, it was a continuous psychological test. The reinforced windows fogged up inside, creating a murky filter that separated the confined life from the hostile world that stretched as far as the eye could see. And yet, most of the time, all that was visible was an infinite white. The temperature plummeted so much that simply stepping outside for a few minutes required almost ritualistic preparation, several layers of clothing, equipment adjusted to the millimeter, and the knowledge that any mistake could be fatal. Isolation in this scenario was like a third resident in every room. He was present in every prolonged silence in the mess hall, in every glance that avoided direct contact, in every conversation cut short, because there was no longer any patience for repeated stories. Resources were limited and everyone knew it. Food reserves, rationed with military discipline, were a daily reminder that supplies depended on weather conditions that didn't adhere to human deadlines. A delay in delivery meant replanning everything, adjusting meals, cutting back on small comforts that were already scarce. The water, obtained from melting ice, carried a metallic taste that no one consciously noticed anymore, but which lingered as a reminder that every sip depended on manual labor and precious energy. Amidst this hectic routine, small internal disputes grew out of control. A casual comment at breakfast could echo for days. A misinterpreted look during equipment maintenance could create silent divisions between groups. It was as if the base were a microcosm where every emotion, good or bad, was amplified. And at the center of this emotional minefield was her, always careful, always meticulous, with her little quirks that at first were even seen as an eccentric charm, but which, as the weeks passed, began to grate. She tidied her space almost obsessively, aligning each object as if it were part of an invisible puzzle. Her routines were immutable, the way she checked the door locks, the way she cleaned the equipment before and after use, the way she wrote everything down in a worn notebook she never put down. For some, this was simply discipline. For others, it was an irritating reminder that she wasn't suited to the improvisation required in this place. With the cold and confinement eroding everyone's patience, these small differences became catalysts for tension. The conversations around her began to carry a different tone, whispers that ceased when she approached. There was no direct aggression, but rather a growing distance, a passive resistance that manifested itself in lingering glances, curt answers, and the subtle exclusion of invitations to small, informal gatherings in the cafeteria. Each day felt like a test to see how far she could withstand this invisible pressure, but curiously, she seemed immune, as if she didn't notice or simply didn't care. She continued with her quirks, her methods, and her way of observing the room with watchful eyes, as if waiting for something the others hadn't yet noticed, and perhaps that was precisely what bothered her, the feeling that she knew more than she let on. Do you think, in an environment like this, extreme discipline helps or hinders? The day began like any other at that isolated base, enveloped by a piercing silence and the white expanse that stretched as far as the eye could see. The cold was harsher than usual, and even the metal of the doors creaked with a dry sound, betraying the pressure the climate imposed on everything and everyone. She had grown accustomed to walking with firm, attentive steps, feeling every change in the ice beneath her feet, but that morning there was something different, something the body perceived before the mind could even formulate it. Then it happened. First, a muffled, deep sound that seemed to come not from the surface, but from the bowels of the world. It was as if something colossal had moved underground, displacing layers that had been dormant for centuries. The noise didn't dissipate like an ordinary noise. It lingered there, reverberating, like thunder that refused to go away. Then came the vibration. Small at first, almost like a tremor that could be mistaken for wind buffeting the structures, but she knew better. The sound was accompanied by a continuous shudder, which ran through the metal walls of the base and rose through the frozen ground like a silent electric current. Glasses and tools began to tremble slightly, and a few glances met silently, as if feeling it but unwilling to admit it. She remained still for a moment, focused on capturing every detail of the phenomenon, ignoring the murmur of those trying to understand what had happened. Then came the first fissures, not large cracks that immediately caught the eye, but thin, black, sinuous lines etched into the perfect white of the compacted snow. They appeared near the outdoor warehouse where few people usually passed. What was most disturbing was the speed with which they multiplied, as if the surface itself were drawing a secret map of what was to come. She walked to one of them and crouched down, running her hand lightly over the jagged line. The ice felt as if it were pulsing, breathing, as if hiding something about to emerge. The superiors soon arrived. Their steps were hurried, their voices firm, but with that measured tone that seemed to convey authority. They quickly surveyed the site, exchanged brief remarks and, as expected, downplayed the severity of the situation. They said that crevasses were normal in that type of terrain, that the ice moves naturally, and that there was no reason to be alarmed. But she saw what they didn't want to say. One of them looked away when he noticed one of the deeper scars, and another pressed his lips together, as if holding back a concern that couldn't be revealed. The instructions were simple and cold. Maintain normal operations, reinforce perimeter inspections, and avoid unnecessary comments to avoid creating panic. But she knew this wasn't routine. The sound, the vibration, the sudden formation of fissures. Nothing fit the usual pattern the veterans described. As they returned to the warmth of the control room, she remained outside for a few extra seconds, observing. The wind was strange, carrying a different frequency, and there was an energy in the air that couldn't be explained by meteorology alone. The mood in the cafeteria was ambiguous. Some laughed nervously, trying to turn the episode into a joke, while others looked sideways, as if afraid to voice their feelings. For her, there was no doubt. That day had marked the beginning of something bigger. The muffled sound still echoed in her memory, and the floor seemed to hold a secret that threatened to surface at any moment. The problem was that no one there was willing to face the truth, and the silence imposed by her superiors created an even more suffocating tension. As night fell, the cold intensified, and the distant cracking of ice returned, louder and more frequent. She noticed that the pattern of cracks was expanding toward the central area, where the base sat. The vibrations that had previously been subtle could now be felt even within the dormitories. Something was happening down there, something no official report would admit until it was too late. If you were there, would you follow orders and remain silent, or would you alert everyone to what you saw? The wind howled against the base's walls, a dull sound that made the atmosphere even more oppressive. Inside her small observation post, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the map spread out on the table. There was something there that bothered her, something she couldn't ignore. The notes were there, as they always had been, but now with an almost disconcerting clarity. The fissures she had seen in the ground were no ordinary cracks. No, they matched the patterns she had studied before, those mysterious lines on ancient maps. Maps that many had dismissed as irrelevant, but which, in that very moment, began to make perfect sense. She swallowed hard, the weight of the discovery pressing against her chest. What she had thought was a mistake, or perhaps a coincidence, was now becoming an undeniable reality. The base where she worked had been built on a geologically unstable area. Those fissures were no mere coincidence. They signaled an imminent danger, something no one at the base seemed to have considered, something that could be fatal for everyone there. The silent alarm in her mind rang louder and louder, and she knew she had to act quickly. With each glance at the maps and the cracks in the ice, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with alarming precision. She wasn't a geologist, but the logic was there, as clear as the icy sky outside. The foundation had been built without considering the hazards of the area, and now these cracks, these fissures, were signs that the ground was giving way. She felt the weight of a truth no one else seemed to grasp, as if the ground beneath her feet were about to open and swallow everything without warning. But she couldn't do it alone. She couldn't act without alerting others, but the problem was no one believed her. The radio was silent, and the connection to the rest of the base seemed increasingly fragile. With each attempt to contact her, the muffled crackle of the radio told her she was completely isolated. The fear grew with each moment, but so did the urgency. If she didn't act now, the consequences could be devastating. She could rush to the command post, alert everyone to the impending danger, but she knew it would be too late. The terrain was compromised, and the area around her seemed to be crumbling with every second. It was a race against time, but there wasn't enough time. She stood quickly, her heart racing, her steps firm and purposeful. Every movement seemed to echo throughout the empty base, but her focus was on a single goal, making sure the others knew about this before it was too late. Every crack in the ground, every line on the map, every detail she now saw clearly was a clear warning. The danger was there, invisible, yet palpable. The entire base was at risk, and no one seemed to notice. But she knew she had to warn. The silent alarm inside her had been ringing for too long. With trembling hands, she picked up the radio again, trying once more to establish communication with the base. Her anxiety grew, but she knew there was no time to hesitate. The response she expected was not coming. The silence only grew, and a feeling of loneliness took over her. It was as if she were the only one who saw what lay beyond this seemingly peaceful scene. The base, which had seemed an unbeatable fortress, was now about to collapse under its own weight, and she was the only one who realized it. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate slightly, and a chill ran down her spine. It was an inexplicable sensation, yet undeniable. She felt she was about to discover more than she had ever expected. There was something more there, something no one had anticipated. What seemed like a simple crack in the ground could be the beginning of something much bigger. She knew that if she didn't take the necessary measures, the disaster would not be averted. But how could she warn others without them believing her? How could she convince those so absorbed in their daily tasks to see the imminent danger? The fissures weren't just a sign of the ground's instability, they were a warning. She didn't know how far it would go, but she knew that if she didn't act now, the cost would be high. The minutes were ticking by and the pressure in her chest was growing. She took deep breaths, trying to remain calm, but panic was already beginning to creep into her thoughts. What would happen if she couldn't warn anyone? What would happen if it was too late for everyone? She felt the gravity of the situation like never before, and the responsibility of making the right decision now became overwhelming. Have you ever had to make a decision in a moment of urgency? What would you do if you were in her shoes? Comment below, we want to hear your opinion. The radio crackled when she tried to speak, but the response was filled with disbelief. On the other end, a voice too calm for the gravity of the situation said there was nothing unusual. She took a deep breath and repeated the warning, detailing what she had seen. The sound of the cracks, the vibration in the ice, the wind shifting direction as if heralding a hidden storm. The silence that followed was more uncomfortable than any direct response, but it was soon broken by muffled laughter and sarcastic comments. One said she was seeing snow ghosts. Another asserted it was just rookie anxiety, that this type of ice was solid enough to support even a convoy. With each word of disbelief, she felt the heat of indignation grow, as if every cell in her body were reacting to the disrespect, but her voice did not waver. She continued insisting, explaining that it was not a vague impression, but a precise observation, that anyone with the slightest attention would notice that the structure beneath their feet was unstable. The looks in their eyes began to change. They were no longer just mocking, but uncomfortable, as if her insistence were an affront to the authority of those who considered themselves too experienced to listen. One of the commanders, with an erect posture and a cold gaze, replied curtly that the mission would continue, and that there was no time for tales of cracking ice. She realized that their resistance stemmed not just from ignorance, but from pride. Admitting she might be right meant acknowledging that command had failed to recognize such an obvious risk, and that to them was unthinkable. Every muffled laugh, every dismissive gesture served to further isolate her position. She was not just fighting against physical danger, but against the unspoken politics that governed those decisions. The tension in the air grew thick, almost palpable, as she reinforced the urgent need for evacuation. The temperature seemed to drop faster at that moment, as if the atmosphere itself wanted to prove her point. But for them, retreating was admitting defeat to someone who, in the hierarchy, shouldn't defy orders. What irritated her most wasn't their denial, but their blind confidence in their own authority, even in the face of clear signs. As she spoke, she felt like each word was a stone thrown against a wall of ice too thick to be broken logically. They looked at each other, exchanging subtle gestures, and it made it clear that her insistence was being registered not as caution, but as indiscipline. The wind outside beat against the walls of the base, and she knew the sound wasn't lying. Still, it was as if she were shouting into a void. It was a bitter sensation, seeing the danger, feeling the danger, and being treated as if she were making it all up. And if it were you, would you keep insisting or would you keep quiet to avoid confrontation? The early morning was cold, colder than anyone could have imagined. The silence was dense, almost oppressive, and the wind cut through the icy air like invisible blades. The base, isolated in the heart of the ice, seemed imperturbable, resistant to the relentless climate that tried to devour everything around it. Every wall of the structure, every heavy machine, every piece of equipment was there to support the weight of nature. But the force approaching, slow and uncontrollable, was something no one at the base could have predicted. In the middle of the night, the world seemed to pause, frozen in time, as if nothing could disturb this barren, desolate landscape. Until, suddenly, a terrifying crash cut through the stillness like a clap of thunder. The sound was so deep, so deafening, it seemed to come from the very center of the earth. Something had given way. Something was breaking, and the impact reverberated through every wall, every steel beam. The ground, which had always seemed solid and safe, began to tremble beneath the feet of the base's occupants, a tremor that spread like a wave, consuming everything in its path. It was as if the planet itself had revolted, unleashing a wave of destruction without warning. The ground, which had seemed so reliable until then, split open in a deep crack, a gash that stretched for miles, swallowing everything in its path. The base, with all its imposing structure, began to crumble, chunks of the foundation sinking rapidly, as if the ice that had supported everything for so long was succumbing under the weight of its own fragility. Panic gripped everyone. The sound of the structures collapsing wasn't just a physical sound, but a collective cry of despair, a silent plea amidst the chaos. The lights flickered, trying in vain to offer some solace, but darkness soon set in. A darkness not just physical but emotional, as if all sense of safety had been ripped away the moment the ground gave way. With the ground collapsing, communication with the outside world completely failed. All systems that had previously seemed unbreakable were suddenly silenced. There was no longer any connection to the outside world, only the sound of structures colliding and people desperately trying to understand what was happening. Panic spread faster than the tragedy, with screams of alarm echoing through the corridors, but nothing could stop the acceleration of the process. The abyss, which had opened in the center of the base, now swallowed everything with merciless ferocity. What had once seemed like a solid base, a fortress amidst the ice, was now being destroyed from the inside out. Fear, visceral and primal, gripped the base's occupants. Every second was more tense, the air becoming thicker, harder to breathe, as the walls began to cave in. There was no time to think. The only instinct was to flee. But where to? The world outside was as unpredictable as what was happening inside the base. Everything they knew and trusted was dissolving before their eyes. That's when she realized the worst was yet to come. She stood there amidst the chaos, watching reality crumble around her. The ground, which until yesterday had seemed unshakable, was now giving way. The walls of the base began to tilt, the structures crumbling, and she, unsure of what to do, found herself paralyzed, powerless in the face of the magnitude of the tragedy. The sight of the abyss that was forming was indescribable. The crack in the ground, which had once been a small line, was now a deep chasm, a gigantic crevasse that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The metal structures, which had been designed to withstand anything, were now sinking, as if made of paper. The ice that had once served as the foundation of the base was giving way under the weight of the destruction, and the sound of metal breaking and colliding with ice seemed like a distant echo of a world that was shattering. Panic spread, and a sense of helplessness gripped everyone. Without communication, without knowing what was happening outside that isolated territory, fear became an enemy even more present than any natural disaster. They were trapped, alone, in a base that could no longer protect them. The ground, which was crumbling into pieces, no longer offered any kind of safety. The base, which had seemed like the ultimate fortress, was now a place of hopelessness. Chaos was no longer just a threat, but a reality that asserted itself with every passing second. And she knew in that instant that the fight for survival would no longer be against the cold, nor against the ice. It was against the unknown, against the relentless force that had revealed itself there, the moment the ground gave way. How would you react if you were in a situation like this? What would be your survival instinct? Comment below. The snow crunched beneath her boots with each hurried step, as if each icy grain were a personal obstacle she had to fight against. The wind bit at her face, trying to steal her breath, but she didn't slow down. The map was clutched to her chest, protected inside her jacket, as if it were a secret that could change everything. And it was. Ever since that yellowed piece of paper had fallen from the forgotten file in the locked closet, her mind had been on empty. The hand-scrawled lines, the ancient symbols, the notes nearly erased by time. Everything screamed that there was something there no one else knew. She knew she couldn't trust everyone. The base was divided between those who believed the crisis was temporary and those who had already given up hope. But she had seen the signs, felt the vibrations in the ice, heard sounds that weren't just the natural crackling of the frozen landscape. Something was moving beneath her feet. And somehow the map confirmed it all. The marked spot was just a few meters from a snow formation that had always been considered just another irregular accumulation left by the wind. But as she approached, she noticed the details no one else noticed. A smoother than usual mound, a slightly oval outline that betrayed something buried there. Kneeling, she began to shovel the snow with her thick gloves, her fingers already numb from the cold, until the characteristic sound of metal on ice echoed. It was a lid, camouflaged with a near-perfect white coat. The paint, already peeling, revealed a dark hue that contrasted with the surroundings. With effort, she found the side lever, covered in hardened ice. She had to tap it until she felt the latch give way with a dry snap. A breath of warmer air escaped through the crack, an almost surreal contrast to the cold that dominated the surface. There, beneath the snow, was the entrance to the evacuation tunnels. Ancient structures built decades ago, probably during wartime, when paranoia of attacks led to the construction of escape routes that would never appear in official reports. No one at the current base knew about this, and it was obvious why. It wasn't part of any training, any manual, any history passed down from veterans. It was a secret buried by the institution itself. Descending a few steps, she noticed the walls were clad in metal and concrete, and that there were still lamps, some working, powered by who knows what source. The sound of her own heart echoed in the narrow space, mixed with the rhythmic drip of melting water somewhere in the distance. The sensation was claustrophobic, yet comforting at the same time. Here was proof that there was a way out no one else had imagined. Walking a few meters, she encountered forks, steel doors, sealed storage rooms. The air smelled different, a mixture of rust and history, as if every molecule carried decades of enforced silence. She knew that by revealing this, she wouldn't just be showing an escape route. She would also be exposing that someone, at some point, had decided to hide this information from everyone. Perhaps to maintain control, perhaps so that only a privileged few would know how to escape in an emergency. Holding the flashlight tightly, she memorized every detail, every mark on the walls, every sign of past maintenance. When she returned to the surface, she would have to decide with whom to share this secret, and that choice could change alliances, topple leadership, or save lives. Outside, the wind roared as if trying to cover what she had just discovered, but it was too late. The secret of the tunnels was back on the surface, ready to challenge the established order. If you discovered a secret path that could save everyone, would you reveal it or keep it to yourself? The cold seemed to seep into her bones, making each step heavier, but she didn't hesitate. Her breath formed quick clouds in the air, and the sound of hurried boots echoed in the narrow corridors of the base, now plunged into near-total darkness. The power had gone out minutes before, and with it, any sense of security. The main generator was out, and the ice accumulating on the walls was beginning to break off in heavy chunks, indicating that the structure would not hold for much longer. No one knew for sure what had happened, but everyone knew that if they didn't find the exit quickly, they would be trapped forever in that icy maze. She, who had so often been underestimated, now walked ahead, with firm steps and a trembling flashlight in her hands. It wasn't ideal equipment, but it was enough to allow her to see the cracks in the ground and avoid the areas where the ice seemed about to give way. Behind her, a row of tense faces followed her in silence. Some were the same ones who, days ago, had chuckled softly when her name was mentioned on the most demanding climbs. Now each of them kept their eyes fixed on her back, as if they lost sight of her for even an instant, their destiny would change forever. The contrast was almost poetic. Before, she had been the butt of jokes, the fragile newbie who couldn't handle the pace. Now, she was the only one who seemed to know where to go. Her voice, low but firm, echoed in short orders. "Be careful on the left. It's unstable here. Go fast. Stop for a second." There was no room for hesitation. Every command was obeyed as if it were law, and no one dared question it. The distant sound of cracking ice reminded them that time was against them. In certain sections, the corridor narrowed so much that the group had to pass one by one, forcing them to smell the old ice mixed with rusty metal. In others, the floor creaked under their weight, and she carefully tested each section with her foot before allowing others to pass. It was like guiding a group through thin glass where any mistake would mean doom. The air felt heavier with each turn, and the temperature dropped rapidly. But she remained calm, knowing that any sign of panic could spread like wildfire. At a critical moment, they reached a crossroads. The one on the right seemed safer, with less accumulated ice, but she noticed small marks on the ceiling indicating that the pressure above was about to break that section. Without explaining, she turned left, choosing the path everyone feared because it was narrower and more unstable. There was a murmur of doubt, but no one dared speak out. Minutes later, they heard the crash of the ceiling of the right corridor giving way, blocking the passage forever. If they had gone that way, they would have been buried. The faces following her began to change. It was no longer just fear, but a silent recognition that without her, none of them would make it to the surface alive. The weight of responsibility didn't crush her. On the contrary, it seemed to strengthen her. Every step was calculated. Every decision carried the certainty of someone who has understood that leadership, in moments like these, isn't about status or rank, but about knowing what to do when everyone else is paralyzed. The last stretch before the exit was the most treacherous. The floor, covered in a thin layer of translucent ice, hid deep cracks. She urged everyone to crouch low and move slowly, distributing their weight so as not to break the surface. The sound of ice cracking under their boots made everyone's heart race, but she kept her voice steady, guiding them step by step. Finally, a shaft of natural light appeared at the end of the corridor, filtering through the partially frozen emergency door. It took a concerted effort to open it, but when the cold, clean air rushed in, everyone knew they were alive thanks to her. Outside, the silence was no longer tense, but reverent. Those who had mocked her now looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. They had seen firsthand what it meant to have composure, courage, and instinct in a situation where a second of indecision could cost everything. She said nothing. She simply stared back, taking a deep breath as the wind carried away any trace of the contempt she had once felt from them. Have you ever lived in a time when those who doubted you had to rely solely on you to survive? Respect earned in silence is one of the greatest triumphs anyone can achieve. It's not the kind of recognition expressed with words or applause. Sometimes it comes disguised as stillness, in looks that say more than any sentence could ever convey. When she finally reached the safe surface, there were no speeches, no crowd waiting to celebrate. What there were silent glances, filled with a deep recognition and perhaps a regret that can only be understood by those who know the weight of such a journey. The tension that had enveloped her dissipated as she rose from the ice, leaving behind what seemed like the end but was actually only the beginning. She knew that in her silence she had spoken louder than any words could have. All those who had doubted her were now silenced, not by the sound of her voice but by the depth of what she had achieved. Her return, bringing with her the truth hidden in the depths of the ice, was not only a mission accomplished, but a lesson in perseverance, courage, and unwavering faith. As she stood there, observing the faces of those who had once underestimated her, she felt at peace not because she sought revenge, but because she knew her true victory lay in the certainty that without her action, everyone would be buried in the same uncertain fate. She, without needing words, had been the savior, not by imposition, but by action. What she did was not just save others, it was save herself. Earning respect in silence is understanding that the greatest victories are often celebrated not with shouts, but with looks that recognize the grandeur of a courageous act. The ice, with its cold immensity, had become the perfect setting to prove that when words fail, actions speak louder. She didn't need public recognition because she already knew deep down that she had done what was necessary. The true value of her actions didn't depend on the validation of others, but on the certainty she carried within herself. Without the maps she had discovered, everyone would be buried in the same darkness. And in the end, all that remained for her was the serenity of duty fulfilled. There was nothing left to prove except to herself. She knew that true strength is not measured by immediate recognition, but by the silent impact we leave on the lives of others. Respect earned this way is unbeatable, for it doesn't need applause to exist. It is present in actions, in looks, and above all, in the choices made in the most difficult moments. Now, she moves forward, but not without first realizing that her courage was more than just a mission. She became a representation of the power we all possess, even when no one is looking. Each of us has the potential to earn that quiet respect, to act with the same courage and determination, without seeking external approval, but striving to make a difference when all seems lost. If you were touched by this story, like this video now, and subscribe to continue following journeys of courage, overcoming, and transformation. In the next video, we'll explore more deeply how we can apply this same silent strength to our own lives, earning respect where we least expect it. Write in the comments, "I'm ready to conquer my respected silence." Don't miss the next chapter of this journey.